Have you ever heard of Thanos? I'm gonna guess you probably have. You've probably also heard of Drax, Gamora, or Shang-Chi. But do you know the guy who created all those characters? That's right, it's all one guy, and his influence on the world of comic books is immeasurable. And I really think he fixed a long-running problem that existed in the medium before his time, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. Jim Starlin wrote some of the most influential comic book stories for both Marvel and DC over the course of his long career. This includes the Infinity Gauntlet, the Infinity War, and A Death in the Family, the one where the Joker kills Robin. And along with all these huge events that crossed every single character in Marvel's lineup, he also created a huge body of work with individual characters like Adam Warlock, the Silver Surfer, Thanos, Batman, Darkseid, and Dreadstar. Starlin is also a double threat. He both writes and draws a lot of his work, so I think for me that's why a lot of the Warlock stuff works so well, because it literally is the singular vision of one creator. So while his huge cast of original characters is Jim Starlin's strength, he also has a special talent for rehabilitating existing characters and making them interesting. Adam Warlock went from an infantile, barely human character with very little function to an intricate demigod with a storied history of interaction with both the earthbound and cosmic side of Marvel's universe. But maybe Jim Starlin's best work is what I consider the greatest Captain Marvel story ever told. It also happens to be the first ever graphic novel published by Marvel Comics. I read it when I was 12 years old, and it had a huge impact on me. This book is The Death of Captain Marvel. I've been reading comic books pretty much forever. Some of my favorite childhood memories involve reading stacks and stacks of Spider-Man reprints, reading through some random Captain America issues that I had, and really getting familiar with the work of Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko through the Marvel Essentials paperback collection. There's a reason this art form was originally designed and marketed towards children exclusively, although it obviously has matured over its lifetime. The stories are exciting, bright, colorful, and they go on forever, so there's never any shortage of things to read. But when I was like 11 or 12, I started to see the problem with comic books. I loved reading them, but this obvious issue kept coming back that made them less and less satisfying as time went on. No matter how cosmic the threats, no matter how gigantic the explosions, and no matter how high the stakes, everything returned to the status quo at the end of every single story. Now, within the last 15 or 20 years, this has become far less an issue in the comic book world. While the two big publishers absolutely still do this and will probably continue to do it forever because those characters make money, a lot of independent publishers have leaned really heavy into telling close-ended stories that can have permanent consequences for all the characters. One of my favorite recent examples of this is Saga, which if you haven't read, I highly recommend. Throughout the course of the story, things happen and people die, and those changes are permanent, and we know that when the story concludes, these things will not be undone or reset or time traveled away. Another epic story that takes place over a long run but has permanent consequences is Invincible, something I read earlier this year. Interestingly, actually, I would say both Saga and Invincible take cues from a lot of early Marvel work in different but interesting ways. Saga really leans into the universe-wide cosmic space battle aspect that we saw in a lot of Jack Kirby's work with Marvel Comics, but that was really expanded upon by Jim Starlin in the 70s. Invincible pulls from the long-standing history of superheroes to tell us a story that has real ramifications and consequences for every time a superhero uses violence or action to get something done. Also, all of the characters permanently change over the course of the story, and things happen to them that cannot be undone. So while things have been a little bit better lately, I do want to point back to right before Jim Starlin started working with a lot of his cosmic characters, because that's when the problem of everything returning to the status quo was at its peak. In the 1970s, comics were beginning to become more mature, but they hadn't quite made it over the hill yet. I mean, sure, at Marvel things were getting a little bit darker. Characters like Ghost Rider and the Punisher had been introduced. Not everything was framed in this Saturday morning cartoon aesthetic, with some of the visuals being a little bit more harsh and gritty, and a few small character changes did stick and were permanent. But up to this point, there were only like a couple characters that had actually permanently died and would not be returning. There was Captain America's sidekick Bucky, there was Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, and there was Gwen Stacy, but none of the superheroes could ever be finally fully defeated. And then in 1982, Jim Starlin changed that. Up to this point, Starlin had been working with his cast of cosmic characters like Thanos and Nebula and Drax. He had turned Thanos into an A-list villain, had transformed Warlock into a complex and interesting character, and had really earned a fandom within Marvel's artistic community. So when he was given the opportunity to create Marvel's first ever graphic novel, he took it and ran with the idea. And to make it memorable, he did something that we weren't seeing from any artist or writer at the time: a permanent superhero death. Now, I don't want to reveal too much about the Death of Captain Marvel's plot, because if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But there's a few details that I want to point out here that I think make it a very enriching experience. First, I want to note that the version I read as a kid included inside of it a bunch of prior issues of Captain Marvel's solo adventures from over the years. This gives us context as to the level of power the character has, who he has fought in the past, and how everything did return to normal at the end of every issue for him. Captain Marvel always saves the day, and everything always returns to the way it was. And another thing you need to know before you read the death of Captain Marvel is that at this point in Marvel's continuity, Jim Starlin's most famous creation, Thanos, had died a few years prior. Now, we all know now that that death was not permanent, and much like any other character in comics, he was bound to come back whenever they needed him for a future story. But at this point, every character within the universe who knew of Thanos knew him to be dead, including Captain Marvel, who had fought him many times. Over the course of the death of Captain Marvel, our hero discovers that he has terminal, incurable cancer, and as the title suggests, we then see him slowly die. Like I said, I want to leave out the specifics of the entire plot because Jim Starlin's artwork and writing really come together in a great way here. But it's a touching story that reminds us that even inside the Marvel universe, with all of these cosmic heroes and villains, there are some very human things that can happen to people. So when I read this as a kid, it blew my mind. I tried to find future stories starring Captain Marvel, but they didn't exist because when the character died in this book, he had actually died. This was the character's final appearance. And the impact of this story really can't be understated because it's currently one of the only permanent deaths that actually still applies in the Marvel Universe continuity. You know how earlier I mentioned Bucky, Captain America's sidekick, and Uncle Ben and Gwen Stacy? Well, in Ed Brubaker's The Winter Soldier, Bucky returned as an assassin hired to kill Captain America, who would eventually become a good guy again. And an alternate universe version of Gwen Stacy now swings along Spider-Man as a character called Spider-Gwen. Only Uncle Ben remains actually dead, making Captain Marvel's place as one of those permanently dead characters much more interesting. Now, Jim Starlin would go on to write a story that you've probably heard of. It involves Thanos collecting a bunch of Infinity Stones, putting them in a gauntlet, and eliminating half of all life in the universe. That's the Infinity Gauntlet, and it would go on to become the highest grossing movie of all time, besides Avatar. So not only did the death of Captain Marvel transform Jim Starlin's trajectory at Marvel, it also changed Marvel's actual real-world publication output. The success of this book as Marvel's first graphic novel led to the publishing of a variety of other titles throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the present day. This includes one of Starlin's other works, a Hulk and Thing crossover book. I recently picked up that crossover book, and along with a stack of Warlock stories, I made my way to Ontario, California for Comic-Con Revolution. After 15 years of reading his books and studying his artwork, I was able to actually meet Jim Starlin in person. He's an incredibly kind person to talk to, and I highly recommend if you have a chance to meet him or get a signature from him that you take advantage of that opportunity. For someone who's so legendary in the comic book world, he's so open and humble to talk about the things that he created. If you do get a chance to meet him, take a second to do what I did, and thank him for killing Captain Marvel.